The original California cult. I'm Jason Horton.
I'm Rebecca Lieb.
And this is Ghost Town.
Back in the 1950s, when Synanon came to public attention, it was a drug and alcohol rehabilitation program.
I found an environment that was a loving environment. I found a place that was humane, and I found a place that was very firm. All of the things that I needed to change my behavior.
The organization is composed of what Synanon calls dope fiends, squares, and delinquent children, punks. Synanon educates, clothes, and feeds its members, and in return, most of them turn over their personal wealth and work for Synanon.
Today we're going to be talking about something that, even if you don't recognize the name, you'll recognize the stories, certainly the tactics, some of the habits, themes, and at the very least, it will touch on rehabilitation and wellness culture that I feel like we're immersed in every day. You'll recognize the story because we hear it over and over through lots of fringe religions gone mainstream and wellness initiatives turned oppressive. We're talking about the original West Coast insane fucking cult posing as sober wellness, Synanon. And I hope I'm saying that right. Some people say Synanon, some people say Synanon. I'm going to go with Synanon. Addiction has always been a really complicated diagnosis, and to nobody's surprise, has been around since humans have been making mind-altering substances. The Bible references Noah's drinking habits and intoxication, the use of opium in Syria in the 7th century BC, cocoa leaves in the Andes, to Chinese cannabis, to on and on and on. And it was always this mysterious thing to be an addict. Even up until the 1950s, the general idea of most addiction was, in medical communities, that it could not be cured. If it was treated at all, it was by doctors and hospitals, and more often than not, those suffering from addiction eventually were sent to jail. Until Synanon. Though it was not the first rehab or structure around wellness, Synanon did a ton to convince the American public that addicts could be saved. It really started the idea of sponsorship, that recovery could happen, and that those in recovery could help other people in recovery. And while there were good things about Synanon, it was founded on the shoulders of Charles Dietrich, and became a cult unlike anything LA had ever seen. So it all started with this guy, Charles Dietrich, a sales exec from Ohio who moved to SoCal after his first divorce. After spending almost 20 years as a nomadic alcoholic, he remarried in 1956, and again, at the bequest of his probably very frustrated wife, gave AA a try. Second marriage didn't last, but the program did, and he quickly became a huge promoter of the Alcoholics Anonymous lifestyle. The one thing Dietrich didn't like was that AA didn't accept other substance abusers. Now, there was, at the time, a Narcotics Anonymous in LA, but it was still very disorganized and rarely met. So in 1958, Dietrich took part in a UCLA study that involved LSD. Speaking to an oral historian documenting Synanon's short history in 1962, Dietrich called it the most important single experience in my entire life, crediting the drug with unlocking a newfound confidence. He says, "I became a different person, really and truly. Everything that has happened to me since Synanon, everything dates back to that point." It was then that he decided to form his own group that, unlike AA, embraced all kinds of addicts. He first called this group the Tender Loving Care Club. One day, a young heroin addict named Whitey Walker, fresh out of prison, joined the group. As he invited friends, the language grew a little bit coarser, a little less loving. The crosstalk became more aggressive. It took on a totally different feel. Dietrich loved it. The sessions became known as Synanons, a portmanteau of symposium or togetherness or perhaps seminar, and anonymous. Dietrich, who provided couches for people to crash on as they kicked heroin and any other habit that they were trying to detox from, would come to believe that addicts weren't full-fledged adults and shouldn't be treated as adults. The younger addicts took to calling him Dad. Based on these sessions, the Tender Loving Care Club evolved to be just called Synanon. Synanon was launched in a dingy Santa Monica storefront as a 2-year residential program, but Dietrich soon concluded that its members could never graduate, because a full recovery was impossible, according to him. The program was based on testimony of fellow group members about their tribulations and urges of relapsing and their journeys to recovery. Synanon differed from Alcoholics Anonymous in that it was directed towards both drug users and drinkers. Dietrich was said to have coined the phrase, "Today is the first day of the rest of your life," for the program. He was a stern person, kind of abrasive, not very friendly to the people around him. He believed that this tough love was necessary to achieve and maintain sobriety, and used that with his first wave of residents. So if you were registering to go to rehab at Synanon, here's what would happen. First off, the program rejected any form of pharmaceuticals or tapering off of drugs. Everyone went cold turkey, and junkies were left on a couch to weather their withdrawal and detox alone. For their first 90 days in the community, members were expected to completely cut contact with everyone they knew outside. Sound familiar? I thought so. During its first decade, Synanon members entered into a 1 to 2 year program in 3 stages, aimed at preparing them to re-enter greater society. This would soon change. During the first stage, members did community and housekeeping labor. During the second stage, members worked outside of the community but still resided within the community, going to meetings and being a part of the culture. Finally, during the third stage, members both worked and lived outside but still attended regular meetings. But really, the benchmark of the treatment was called the game. You'd play the game, which was this bizarre group therapy where people sat in a circle to express and often shout their frustrations at each other. This confrontational approach was a way to hash out everything that bothered you about others in your group, but was couched in a way of helping them, learning about yourself, etc. The game started with a question, like, "The most boring person in this circle is," or "What really pissed you off most this week?" You know, something provocative but not too out there. But then it would escalate. While playing the game, the stuff you said didn't even need to be true. Lying was just one of the many things that were allowed in the game, which could last anywhere from 1 hour to 48 hours. Later on, it would be known as attack therapy and was the first step of Dietrich's grooming and brainwashing for what was to come. Many of Synanon's Santa Monica neighbors weren't happy to have a rehab in their midst, so the Synanon residents were outcast early on. Some of the treatment was rooted in stigma. Others, treatment by the neighbors felt pretty legit. In 1961, Dietrich spent just under a month in jail for zoning violations and operating a hospital without a license. He was guilty on both counts. I can absolutely see how neighbors might find that questionable. All of this legal stuff that got in the way of these treatments and rehabilitation only served to bond the Synanites and elevated Dietrich to this kind of martyr status, suffering unjust incarceration for his beliefs, etc. And the media latched on. They loved this story. Early on, the Los Angeles Times ran a 2-part feature on the group. The Los Angeles Mirror published a 4-part series. A 14-page photo spread in Life magazine, hailing Synanon as a tunnel back into the human race, was followed by a glowing write-up in Time magazine. It's a lot of very good press. In the early 1960s, Synanon used this momentum to get in with Hollywood. Guest speakers in 1963 alone included Twilight Zone creator Rod Serling, Ray Bradbury, and the original host of The Tonight Show, Steve Allen. Visitors included Leonard Nimoy, Jane Fonda, Charlton Heston, Milton Berle, Timothy Leary, and Cesar Chavez. Synanon had some pretty cool parties, too, because they had so many jazz musicians enrolled in the program. Dietrich insisted recovery rates were anywhere from 80 to 100%, though those figures were never confirmed by, anyone. Some observers claim that fewer than 70 people in Synanon's entire existence, of the thousands who sought treatment, could reasonably have been claimed as rehabilitated. But again, it's hard to say considering the program's founder claimed there is no such thing as rehabilitation, and that staying with the organization is the only true path. 1965 was a big year for Synanon. A film was made about it starring Academy Award winner Edmund O'Brien as Dietrich himself, and it was even filmed on location in Santa Monica with the full cooperation of the whole organization. Maybe more notably, Synanon started quietly buying up land in Marin County, California. It would eventually have 3 sites in the county, comprising just over 3,300 acres in total, making it the largest private property owned in the county. Dietrich made it quite clear early on that treating addicts was merely a byproduct of his larger mission. Synanon's real aim was to create an experimental society that would transform the world. To Dietrich, Synanon was a new way of living, as important as any to the world's major religions. With the help of Hollywood and being a registered religion, and of course its million-per-year sales of promotional items, Synanon expanded and was almost normalized, as much as AA in California. In fact, juveniles in the justice system were often ordered to enroll in Synanon by California courts if they had some kind of substance abuse issue. In 1967, Synanon also purchased a gigantic new building in Santa Monica called Club Casa del Mar. First built as a hotel in 1926 and then used by the U.S. Army during World War II, the building sat on an insane part of Santa Monica Beach. Now it's a hotel again, and you can even stay there. The rooms range from, just $700 a night to $1,600 a night. At this point, Dietrich himself abandoned Santa Monica, moving north. Synanon was so in style that even non-addicts wanted in. They were reluctantly allowed, called lifestylers, and by 1967, Synanon broadened its mission to include research into the causes of alienation and delinquency. These lifestylers were allowed to have jobs outside of Synanon and live outside of Synanon's community, provided they gave most of their income to the organization. This experiment with lifestylers wouldn't last long, though, as this type of member was often accused of not being committed enough. Most lifestylers washed out of the program, though some joined the ranks fully, leaving their homes behind as a show of true solidarity. After starting in 1968 with just 40 people, by now it had 823 active members and some incredibly expensive new headquarters. It was bringing in roughly $1.2 million from its various businesses, including gas stations and a manufacturer of branded promotional items. By 1976, it would gross $8.7 million, with estimated assets of over $30 million. By the end of the 1960s, the group was becoming even more isolationist, with Dietrich declaring that it would no longer graduate any of its members. So you would just stay. What little pretense the group had about helping addicts to rejoin the outside world had been dropped. By 1972, Synanon was a completely drug-free environment, save for aspirin, caffeine, and LSD. Lots and lots of LSD. In 1974, Synanon moved to become a recognized religion within their use of LSD. It was running up against some controversy, obviously, with that, but also some other issues, including some IRS recognition of the group, because it really wanted to maintain its tax-exempt status. It didn't work, though. The IRS never officially recognized Synanon as a religion, though it would be at least another decade before it finally stripped the company of its nonprofit status. The nonprofit status was key. It's what helped people give donations. It's what got it its whole financial footing. At the same time, Synanon moved from nonviolent tactics within its treatment to violent ones. Suspected spies were severely beaten. Teenagers sent to Synanon to help cure juvenile delinquency were regularly physically abused for insubordination. Everyone in the group started shaving their heads. Says Phil Ritter, who entered the Bay Area branch of Synanon, there was a lot of drugs around, a lot of negativity. He sold his car, moved into the 8-story Synanon building in downtown Oakland, shaved his head, a practice that had begun as punishment and a way to haze newcomers, but he was becoming more or less part of the norm. In fact, many Synanon members would appear with shaved heads as extras in George Lucas's dystopian science fiction film THX 1138. Working as a mechanic at a Synanon-owned auto repair shop, he made $50 a month. People moved to the northern compound if they were truly dedicated. Children inside the Synanon cult were raised communally. This was a common practice romanticized by utopian communities of the 19th and 20th century. Dietrich was also becoming less interested in having any children around, telling many members that if they wanted to have kids, they probably shouldn't be a part of it. I understand it's more like crapping a football than anything else, Dietrich would say about childbirth in 1976. By January of 1977, no kids was the official policy. Men were pressured to get vasectomies, and women were shamed into getting abortions. Notably, Dietrich didn't get a vasectomy himself. Chuck Dietrich had a wife, too. Her name was Betty, during this whole time. Betty was actually very well-liked. Betty was a strong woman in her own right. She was well-liked, and she seemed to dial back some of Chuck's tyranny. But on April 19th, 1977, she died of lung cancer, and all bets were off. Dietrich's policies became even more insane, extreme, and controlling. Dietrich, who was at this point 64, also wanted to remarry right away. He says, "I set up a flare, like any monarch of old times would have done. I let the word out I was available." Of the 6 women who applied, Dietrich chose Ginny Schroen, a 31-year-old teacher at one of Synanon's schools. Shortly thereafter, though, Dietrich decided that marriage should no longer be permanent. Couples were told to split up and form new 3-year-long love matches. Within days, he split, he broke up his own daughter's marriage, and about 600 couples were divorced by the following year, including a man named Phil Ritter and his wife. By the late 1970s, Synanon had support from over 200,000 businesses and organizations giving to or interacting with Synanon by the late 1970s, including 1 out of every 5 corporations in the Fortune 500, who were listed either as donating or as doing business with them. Synanon had a private security force and formed a paramilitary group, the Imperial Marines, that developed its own type of martial arts called Sindo, and by 1978 the group's reported purchase of over $200,000 in firearms raised eyebrows. In 1978, Phil Ritter, our old friend Phil, the guy whose wife left him at the rule of Dietrich, would try to take his young daughter from the organization and nearly died doing it. Ritter's wife was still in the organization and had moved with her child to Synanon's Detroit facility. Ritter sought legal action against the cult, and in response, the church sent 2 men to beat him senseless in his own driveway. He wound up in a coma for a week. Press and organizations started seeing how dangerous Synanon had become. Most press was bad press, but the group fought back. After an expose by NBC in 1978, members sent hundreds of ominous letters to the NBC executives threatening physical harm. Synanon sued anybody who wrote a critical article or aired a negative TV segment about it. In 1972, it sued Hearst Corporation over a San Francisco Examiner article that described the cult as, quote, the racket of the century. The most famous incidence of the organization's violence was a planned attack by Synanon on a Los Angeles lawyer. Attorney Paul Morantz had successfully represented a woman who had been held against her will by Synanon. Morantz came home on October 10, 1978, to his house in the Pacific Palisades, opened his mailbox, and was immediately bitten by a rattlesnake with its rattle removed to keep it quiet. His neighbors called an ambulance just in time, saving his life after a quick and extensive treatment with anti-venom. 2 men, 20-year-old Lance Kenton and 28-year-old Joseph Musico, were charged with attempted murder along with Dietrich for conspiring to commit it. Dietrich also had an obsession with recording audio, which didn't help when cops procured 6 tapes weeks later. Here's a part of the audio. Our religious posture is, don't mess with us. You can get killed dead, literally dead. These are real threats, he snarled. They're draining life's blood from us and expecting us to play by their silly rules. We make the rules. I see nothing frightening about it. I'm quite willing to break some lawyer's legs and next break his wife's legs and threaten to cut their child's arm off. This is the end of that lawyer. That is a very satisfactory, humane way of transmitting information. I really do want an ear and a glass of alcohol on my desk. All 3 men were arrested, and Dietrich was drunk, by the way, during this arrest, and pled no contest. Dietrich entered into a plea deal that included probation. Part of the plea deal was that he would have to step down as the head of Synanon. So Synanon was formally stripped of its tax-exempt status in 1991 and almost completely disbanded shortly after that. Phil Ritter eventually reunited with his wife and daughter after they left Synanon in 1978. Morantz still lives in Pacific Palisades. At age 72, he has neuropathy, arthritis, and blood disease he believes may have been an artifact from his snake bite attack. I'm going to set the record, he says, for the longest murder ever. After being convicted, Dietrich moved with his wife into a double-wide mobile home in Visalia. He died in 1977, a few weeks before his 84th birthday. He was saluted on the floor of the House of Representatives by the Bay Area Congressman and future Oakland Mayor, Ron Dellums. Despite its controversies and its downfall, though, the Synanon program is credited with curing some people of their addictions, including jazz musicians Frank Rehak, Arnold Ross, Joe Pass, and Art Pepper, and the actor Matthew Beard. In 1972, Pass formed a band composed of Synanon patients who recorded an album titled Sounds of Synanon. Many former members still value what they see as positive aspects of Synanon, primarily its strong sense of community. They remain in close contact with many of the people that they went through the program with, online chat groups, and some have even gone into business together. A branch of Synanon that was founded in Germany in 1971 is still in operation. And that is Synanon, which still exists.
It's the same old story.
Yeah.
It's the same story. Beginning, middle, and end, they differ a little bit. Some don't have an end, but they all, you notice when the tax exempt status, everything else kind of falls. So you wonder.
Yeah, they need that money.
It's not about the money, but it really is about the money. And it's interesting that it's a group that's founded on about fighting addictions when it seems like the addiction to power, wealth, being feared, being a leader, being looked up to, pretty much getting everything you want. You're getting rewarded, because all these companies are donating. You got celebrities that are involved kind of signing off on this.
Yeah.
So it's just interesting that how intoxicating it must be to be a leader, and then why you did it almost doesn't matter. It's like, oh, now you constantly switch gears, and that becomes the thing.
Yeah, absolutely. The snake story, the snake in the mailbox, I thought was a Scientology story for a very long time. And I think that really speaks to the fact that like so much of this behavior is, I mean, it's horrible, but is interchangeable with these abuses and in these cults and religions, whatever, you can classify it however you want to. But it's just really scary because it never feels like it ends. It's just another one pops up and then another one, and another one preying on people.
Also, really getting a start in the 1950s really primed itself for that time of the 60s and 70s and New Age and people being accepting of things that are kind of, outside of the box thinking, where this is okay, these, communities, and look at all the good that it's doing, but, it's you're being controlled for better or for worse, I suppose. I guess it depends on who you ask. And would it end up being like another, Waco? I don't know. When you start buying up, and it always starts with military and buying up weapons, and it's not like, and this is where we stop.
No.
It's really, this is where we start.
Exactly. And I don't want to discredit the people that actually found benefit in this program, but it's such a small part, it feels like, of the larger abuses and toxicity of this person.
I don't understand how being having 3-year love matches, how does that help? How does having firepower help? How does this guy, I mean, obviously he was drinking if he was drunk at this. So all that stuff went out the window. So there's a point where you can be like, well, this is no longer a tenant of this thing.
Yeah.
So if it helps someone, that is great, but that there's a cutoff point for that. It didn't seem to be the MO of the organization. Became very secondary, it seems.
Yeah, absolutely. Although I will say, I don't like cults, but I do want to stay in that hotel.